First of all, it's just amazing to see all the people who are here, having kind of lived through this. But I'm really particularly very happy to see Pat and Gerry Gurin here because in some ways, although the history has not been fully written yet, some of us do indeed know what the history was about, and the two of them played an absolute critical role. We wouldn't be sitting here, you wouldn't be out here, without the hard work of Pat and Gerry in terms of laying the groundwork and foundation for how all this came about. You have to remember that when I arrived here in 1971, just to put it in a little context, I was a new kid on the block. I didn't have a clue about what was going on. Now, that still may be true today, I don't know, but the fact is that without being taken under their wing, so to speak, there was no way possible we could have done the kinds of things that have resulted in this. But I never forget that big meeting we had upstairs in ISR to talk about what should the name of the program be. And that was a lot of arguments about that. The program for research on Black Americans, the program for research of Black Americans, the Black Americans program, and so on. And all of those had slightly different kinds of nuances. We also had a study that was non-comparative in the sense of focusing only on the African American population. As it turns out, that was considered to be heretical. It was not only that this was unique and new, it was heretical. Why would you do this kind of study on Black Americans, and what were you going to learn from not having the comparative study? That was a major question.
And gravitating toward Pat and James and Gerry was quite natural. What was also, I think, radical at the time was the extent to which they involved the students in working out the issues that were presented in the proposal, in working on the methodology, working on the questions. It was primarily a student effort, as Woody and so many other people and Linda and Robert, I think, can attest. So we were, I guess, too young and ignorant to realize that what we were doing was so incredibly radical.
Sort of wondering what I do with my rest of my life to keep from dying of boredom, and all this inburst James and Belinda and this colleague of wonderful students, and I know Pat and I just sort of felt alive. It was a wonderful time to be alive, and it was just great to be part of it.
That we weren't just doing research to be doing research to lengthen our vidas, but instead the notion was that we were to give voice to the real imperatives and needs of the African American community, which had been overlooked in the kind of social science research that had been done before. And then students, I mean, a lot of them were just much more articulate about this than me. You know, Phil Bowman, you know, if you want to talk about Phil's particular perspectives on things, played an incredible role with regard to how we developed that. There were no computers.
Right. I was about to say that, right. No computers.
Now, Belinda was just a little baby, so. But this proposal was written on a selectric.
Correctable.
But there was a very, very strong sense in that whole movement that started really in the very, very early 60s with the Southern students demanding a right to vote and sitting in at lunch counters and stuff. There was a strong thing that this was going to be different. I just had a sense as a white liberal and all the ups and downs, and you think we're facing it, and then the country goes back, that this was really going to be different. And there was also a strong sense, which is why we're here today, that this had to be run by the people involved, that this was not a case of bringing in a few Black students in and to making them professors and stuff, that this was a national movement that could completely transform our country, and that had to be led and run by the groups involved, first African Americans and
that it was possible to think about more traditional sampling, looking at the notion of a African American sample based upon the distribution of the African American population. That was really a vital aspect of what this study was about. That it would not be an oversample of blacks from various reasons where they were in large numbers on a sample of whites, but that we would start from the distribution of the black population to build that particular sample. And that had all kinds of implications. It meant that Atlanta had to come into the sample as a certainty area. Atlanta would never come into a general population sample of the whole country as a certainty area because it was too small. But the number of blacks who lived in Atlanta was so large that it had to come in as a certainty area. What it meant was that our sampling group had never necessarily done any work in Atlanta. So it all had to be done new and fresh. So half the sample turned out to be something that this sampling group had never looked at, had never been documented and so on. That's where all the cost and everything else came in. And this was another thing that absolutely convinced the sampling people. We showed that the sampling error for the black subpopulations within a number of notable national samples was so unacceptable that indeed that's why they finally believed us when we argued that we had to start from scratch with a sample of the black population. Our field team could not do the work, and we had to go out and do our own training.
Yes.
Yes. I'm looking at Wayne McCullough because he was part of the group that went to Chicago and got shot at. That what we didn't know was that if we were really going to train community interviewers, which we were, and secondly, we were going to be interviewing based on a sample on the distribution of the black population, that put us into locales which were very problematic. For example, New Orleans came into our sample. New Orleans at that point in time had the highest murder rate of any municipality in the United States. And we couldn't even send one interviewer out. We had to send people out in pairs because of issues with regard to what the dangers were. I can tell you some of the Cabrini Green came into the sample because it almost had to in Chicago. That was excitement beyond belief. That was really some excitement. I mean, so, and remember we had all these black graduate students running around, and to this day I shudder about what their parents, we were lucky, nobody really got hurt or anything.
We were lucky, yes.
But here we were responsible for all these people, and they were going into harm's way. I'll tell you that right now. And remember,
people are young and fearless.
They were absolutely fearless.
Yes.
Because remember, the task was these places would come into the sample. So we'd wind up with the third floor of the fifth building and Cabrini Green came into the sample, and we were going to select 3 apartments within that particular area. So that meant we had to send people to knock on those particular doors. The door would open, and the person would then say, I'm from the Institute for Social Research at the university. And could you tell me who are all the adults who live in this household? Because we were going to use the Kish selection table. So that means you had to list all the adults. So you said to them, tell me all the people who are in this household. Think about that for a moment. Because neighborhoods have changed greatly from what our expectation was in terms of what the distribution was in 1970 by 9 years later. And remember, we didn't have the American Community Survey in those particular days, so there couldn't be an update that could be done to get this right. So that was one of the reasons why it cost so much. The other reason why it cost so much is because we were doing the field work ourselves, because our field team in ISR said they just couldn't do this. They had no experience with regard to supervising large numbers of black interviewers. And remember, we said they had to be all black. They really didn't have any experience in it. It turns out we didn't have any experience either. PRBA was a training program. And we were trying to train, a generation of African-American scholars primarily with a certain perspective on how they did research and with a willingness to think about giving voice to the Black American population. It was a training program.
There were times in which we went to Detroit or even as local as Chicago, in this case, where we went down to the motor pool, got the 17-passenger Chrysler van, loaded up the back portion with probably 15 or more boxes, and then our training team was set out to go do this. And this particular trip to Chicago, in which we were starting on a Sunday, we were driving out, I was driving, and I know Linda Chatters was in, were you there, Susan?
No, I wasn't.
You weren't on that trip. Anyway, there were about 4 of us in the van, and we were going to the hotel. And not knowing exactly where I was going, I got off a little bit too early in the south side of Chicago. Went underneath this overpass and was at a stoplight and heard a bang. And what was that? And I just happened to turn around, and sitting in the seat right behind me was Linda Chatters with a full glass panel window beginning to shatter. At which point I did a quick wheelie around the corner, went several blocks where we thought it was safe to see if everybody was all right. She was clearly shaken. And so we immediately got back on the highway and quickly found our way to the hotel. The last part of the story is that I dialed 911 because I knew that I had to report this for certain insurance purposes. Spent the next 3 hours on the phone, busy signal, so I gave it up. Yes.
So one of the things that occurred, while Belinda, myself, and Shirley, and Letha, and the cadre of graduate students who, James mentioned, operated in very collegial ways with us, and undergraduate students behaved like faculty, and, graduate students behaved like senior professors, because they had to for us to get the work done. We went in the field in '79, right? The 3GM proposal, it was dated in '78.
Yes.
That's an indication that, we were running on empty. And so at the same time we were doing all this other stuff, we had to write additional proposals. And James had to go beg money in the interim, from ISR and other sources. And I also looked at your training grant with '79. So in some ways, those proposals were necessary to even sustain the initial data collection.
Around 1980, right after the election of Reagan, James and I think Pat and Gerry had a conversation about trying to get money for the '84 election. And that was before Jesse Jackson had actually decided to run. And I remember us going to New York City, meeting with the Ford Foundation, and I was afraid to talk. I was just scared to talk. And James told me, don't sit there, say something. I don't know what I said. But I said something. Before I got to PRBA, I wasn't sure if I was going to finish my PhD. I wasn't sure. But once I got there, I knew I was.
Something else I learned from this project is the impact that scholarship or the impact that research can have. And I know one of the things that I've tried to do in my career and I've emphasized to my students is we do research not just because we want to publish. We do research because we want to make a difference in the community. And I think that's something else that really the seeds of that were planted for me right here in this project, just the social implications of research and never leaving a community, always leaving a community better than you found it. And I think that that's something I learned right here.
Ron Brown and I worked on that, but David was very instrumental in that Detroit area study, and we included, again, measures of DSM disorders criteria in the Detroit area study. I think that study is probably most famous for the discrimination measures, but mental disorders were measured. So, it makes sense that the NSEL ended up the way it did.
By many persons on the earlier panel, is James's leadership. And I can't tell you how many times I remember us sitting in meetings and we have a lot of work to do and a lot of writing to do, and James would just lay out the conceptual framework so easy. He said, this is so easy, it will write itself. really, that kind of perennial optimism that we could handle what was on our plate, I think actually made a difference to keep us going in doing the work. Another thing that I think a really important contribution of NSAL that many people haven't realized is there's a really nice section of questions that we developed to capture the incarceration experience of the black population. And that grew out in part of, from our first review, we were critiqued heavily of how are we proposing a sample on the black population, and we don't have a prison sample, and how we are excluding this major segment of the black population. And we really scrambled again, but James was, this is easy, and we figured out multiple things, including considering doing a prison sample. I remember us exploring what it would take to do that. But then maybe I should let James talk about what was done with the Jackson, at the Jackson State Prison. So anyway, we eventually developed a nice set of questions on the incarceration history that is a kind of a unique resource in the NSAL study. James is talking about the Caribbean population. In our early conversations of NSAL, we actually explored the possibility of an African immigrant sample as well. And then when we looked at what the cost projections might be from survey research operations, we thought that that kind of was not an option. But even with our initial grant, if you think of the time, this was going to be about 20 years after the NSBA. Everyone was interested in the new millennium, Y2K, there was a lot of interest. And 20 years later, we actually thought we would replicate a lot of the questions that were in the NSBA in the NSAL. Now, there are a number of those questions are there, but not as many as we initially proposed to do, because what happened when we submitted to NIMH, we did have some psychiatric disorders, but not as many disorders that are in the survey. But NIMH said, well, we'll fund this, but they wanted to do this cooperative agreement with what Ron Kessler was doing, what these other studies were doing, and then we were forced to add a lot more psychiatric disorders than we had initially anticipated, and that displaced a lot of the NSBA questions that we had wanted to replicate. So I think that shift is an important one.
I just have one little basic statement in terms of the writing responsibilities. James pulled it all together, did the conceptual model, and did all of the politicking with NIMH and others. Yep, and Ron, yep. Cleo, if I remember correctly, wrote the measures section. David and Woody collaborated on writing the main background lit review. I wrote the what I think was the easiest section, the preliminary studies, for all the stuff we had done with NSBA, us and others. One of the reasons that we pulled in whites, if I remember correctly, was that the major issues in the field were still around racial differences. And so in order to attack the major issues in the field, we brought in whites as a comparison group. And one personal note that almost nobody knows but me and Belinda may not remember, is I was saying, why are we doing Caribbeans? We have a hard enough time finding black folks. And so I called up Belinda complaining, my support group. And again, I always want to keep this, when I complain, I want to keep it in the family. So I called up Belinda at UCLA. Belinda said, I said, I can't believe we're doing this. And Belinda said, oh, you're doing Caribbeans? Oh, that's just wonderful. What a great idea. That's one of the best ideas y'all ever came up with. So then I left that alone.
We had a conversation, one of our telephone calls. We sent them our questions, and Debbie did this wonderful concept map of all of the questions, where they came from, and how they were represented in the study. And the comment was, wow, you certainly have a lot of black stuff in here. Because we'd ask questions about race ID. We're dealing with adolescents. Identity development, very important, so that was an important part of what we incorporated. Race socialization. They are part of families. Family context is very important. And also discrimination. So experiences of discrimination, using David's measure, and a few other questions around whether or not police stopped you, because we're talking about African American and Caribbean black youth.
So we'll talk about pre-NSBA. What did we have in terms of religion, specifically pre-NSBA? And we had virtually no systematic studies of religious participation among Black Americans. They just weren't out there in terms of the available data. We had no research looking at things like church attendance, looking at things like coping, looking at reading religious materials, all the basic things that are a part of religious involvement. It just wasn't available, and it certainly wasn't available for African Americans. Religion studies included basic indicators of religious participation, and we developed measurement models of religious involvement rather than just focusing on sort of public behavioral indicators of religious involvement. We are interested in other aspects of religious involvement. Also for studies looking at church-based informal support, talking with people about what do people in your church or place of worship do to help you out. The responses range from everything to very specific sorts of things that people within churches do. First studies looking at the interface between religion and spirituality among African Americans. And this was generated from a general notion that within the general population, there's often a disconnect between thinking about ourselves as religious versus thinking about ourselves as being spiritual. And that sort of maps onto some basic demographic factors, but we weren't finding that same sort of separation when it came to African Americans. They tended to align themselves. And when we asked people, how religious would you say you are, and followed up with how spiritual would you say you are, many of our respondents said, you just asked me that. The first studies looking at religious participation among Black Caribbeans, so clearly the NSAL was able to contribute to that line of research. Looking at the ways in which African Americans and Black Caribbeans are similar and different in terms of religious participation. And that included some basic indicators like coping, media consumption, religious non-involvement, spirituality, and the demographic, the denominational profiles for the two groups are different as well.
I think the single biggest contribution the NSBA made was in terms of looking within the Black population and trying to understand the heterogeneity and the variation that exists within. I think there had been a long literature on race and mental health before this, but it had been largely based on Black-white comparisons. And to think of what might be the factors within it has been very important.